the life of Jami. I hope the following disproportionate notice of Jami's life will be amusing enough to excuse its length. I found most of it at the last moment in Rosenzweig's Biographische Notizen of Jami, from whose own and commentators' works it purports to be gathered. Nuruddin Abdurrahman, it would help if there were diacritical notes or something to figure this stuff out, but son of Maulana Nizamuddin Ahmed, and descendant on the mother's side from one of the four great fathers of Islam, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, and Ali. Is that what they mean? Or do they mean Hanif, Shafi, Maliki, and Hanbali? What do they mean? Was born 817 Al-Hijra, 1414 of the Common Era, in Jam, a little town of Khorasan, whither, according to the Hept Aklim, 7 climates, his grandfathers had migrated from Desht of Ispahan, and from which the poet ultimately took his takalas, or poetic name, Jami. And this word also signifies a cup, wherefore he says, born in Jam and dipped in the jam of holy lore, for a double reason I must be called Jami in the Book of Song. He was celebrated afterwards in other Oriental titles, Lord of Poets, Elephant of Wisdom, and so on, but often liked to call himself the Ancient of Herat, where he mainly resided. And doesn't Herat resist, doesn't it, isn't it in what used to be territory of Ur? When 5 years old, he received the name of Nuruddin, the Light of Faith, and even so early began to show the metal and take the stamp that distinguished him through life. In 1419, a famous sheikh, Khwaja Mehmed Parsa, then in the last year of his life, was being carried through Jam. I was not then 5 years old, says Jami, and my father, who with his friends went forth to salute him, had me carried on the shoulders of one of the family and set down before the litter of the sheikh, who gave a nosegay into my hand. I just think that's a funny name for a flower, but 60 years have passed, and methinks now I see before me the bright image of the holy man. And if anybody knows what a nosegay is called nowadays, because I think it's called something else, and feel the blessing of his aspect, from which I date after my devotion to that brotherhood in which I hope to be enrolled. What, the brotherhood of purity? Purity? How do you say it in Arabic? Something. So again, when Maulana Fakhruddin Loristani had alighted at his mother's house, I was then so little that he set me upon his knee, and with his fingers drawing the letters of Ali and Umar in the air, laughed delightedly to hear me spell them. He also, by his goodness, sowed in my heart the seed of his devotion, which has grown to increase within me, in which I hope to live, and in which to die. O God, dervish, let me live, and dervish die. And in the company of the dervish, do thou quicken me to life again. Would it be better to render it Ya Allah or Allahumma or whatever he would have used? But oh God, let me live as a dervish, and die as a dervish, and in the company of dervishes, quicken me to life again. Jami first went to a school at Herat, and afterwards to one founded by the great Timur at Samarkand. There, he not only outstripped his fellows in very encyclopedic studies of Persian education, but even puzzled the doctors in logic, astronomy, and theology, whoever with unresenting gravity welcomed him. Lo, a new light added to our galaxy. In the wider field of Samarkand, he might have liked to remain, but destiny liked otherwise, and a dream recalled him to Herat, a vision of the great Sufi master there, Mehmed Saduddin Kashgari of the Naqshband order of dervishes, appeared to him in his sleep, and bade him return to one who would satisfy all desire. Jami went back to Herat. He saw the sheikh discoursing with his disciples by the door of the grand mosque. Jami Masjid, maybe? Or perhaps he had a vision of Mecca or something. But probably, the big congregational masjid, because people tended to, there's a big one in town, and we go to the big one in town once a week, and we go to the little ones for daily prayers. Day after day passed by without daring to present himself, but the master's eye was upon him. Day by day draws him nearer and nearer, till at last the sheikh announces to those about him, "Lo, this day have I taken a falcon in my snare." Now, some people say you can't do the retreat except in one where they have the Friday prayer. And I've seen this, there's narrations to this effect, but it was never intended for there to be, we go even further, even though we have a masjid right in our area. That was never the thing of the initial generations, of this age. Under him, Jami began his Sufi novitiate with such devotion and under such fascination from the master that going, he tells us, but for one summer's day holiday into the country, one single line was enough to lure the tassel gently back again. Lo, here I am, and thou lookest on the rose. By and by, he withdraws, by of course Sufi instruction, into the solitude so long and profound that on his return to men, he has almost lost the power of converse with them. At last, when duly taught and duly authorized to teach as Sufi doctor, he yet will not, though solicited by those who had seen such a vision of him as had drawn himself to Herat, and not till the evening of his life is he to be seen with white hairs, taking that place by the mosque which his departed master had been used to occupy before. Meanwhile, he had become poet, which no doubt winged his reputation and doctrine far and wide through nations to whom poetry is a vital element of the air they breathe. 1,000 times, he says, I repented of such enjoyment that I could no more shirk it than one can shirk what the pen of fate has written on his forehead. As poet, I resounded through the world. Heaven filled itself with my song, and the bride of time adorned her ears and neck with the pearls of my verse, whose coming caravan the Persian Hafiz and Saadi came forth gladly to salute, and the Indian Khosrow and Hassan hailed as a wonder of the world. The kings of India and Rum greet me by letter. The lords of Iraq and Tabriz load me with gifts. And what shall I say to those of Khorasan, who drown me in an ocean of munificence? Thus, though Oriental is scarcely bombast, Jami was honored by princes at home and abroad, and at the very time they were cutting one another's throats. By his own Sultan Abu Sa'id, by Hassan Beg of Mesopotamia, Lord of Tabriz, by whom Abu Sa'id was defeated, the throne, and slain, by Mahomet II of Turkey, King of Rum, who in his turn defeated Hassan, and lastly by Hussein Mirza Bekara, who extinguished the prince whom Hassan had set up in Abu's place in Herat. Such is the house that Jack builds in Persia. As Hassan Beg, however, the Usun Kasan of old European annals is singularly connected with the present poem, and with probably the most important event in Jami's life. I will briefly follow the steps that lead to that, as well as other princely intercourse. In Al-Hijra 877 or 1472 of the Common Era, Jami set off on his pilgrimage to Mecca. He, and on his account, the caravan he went with, were honorably and safely escorted through the intervening countries by order of their several potentates as far as Baghdad. There Jami fell into trouble by the treachery of a follower he had reproved, and who, born 400 years too soon, misquoted Jami's verse into disparagement of Ali, the darling Imam of Persia. Well, see, that's the thing. If you look at Sunni narrations, those who were the enemies of Ali are the disbelievers. Those who exaggerate the position of Ali and the other close companions, they are the rejectors. And those who take their side, actually take their side, they're the believers. And the same analogy is drawn comparing to Jesus. The Muslimin are the true believers in Jesus, whether they're called Muslimin or not. And you have the rejectors, which are the Christians, because they got all fanatical and worship Jesus, and as a rule don't follow his teachings. They follow Paul instead, and are not at all. They're like, oh, even fornication and bloodshed and stuff like this, we don't even feel like following that. So we're not going to even try. It's one thing if you try and fail, but anyways. And the straight up enemies, of course, are even worse. They're the full on disbelievers. But because honestly, regardless of what problem you have with some religious group or whatever, don't take it out on your relationship with God. This getting wind at Baghdad, the thing was brought to solemn tribunal, at which Hassan Beg's two sons assisted. Jami came victoriously off, his accuser pilloried with a docked beard in Baghdad marketplace. But the poet was so ill-pleased with the stupidity of those who believed the report that, standing in verse on the tigress's side, he calls for a cup of wine to seal up lips of whose utterance the men of Baghdad were unworthy. After 4 months' stay there, during which he visits at Hela, the tomb of Ali's son, Hussein, who had fallen at Karbala, the 10th of the 61st year, he sets forth again to Najaf, where he says his camel, sprang forward at the sight of Ali's own tomb, crosses the desert in 22 days, meditating on the Prophet's glory, to Medina. And that's actually quite a feat. Usually people take a month or so's journey just for the Arabian part to Medina, and so at last to Mecca, where, as he sang in ghazal, back in the day before cars and all that, where he sang in a ghazal, he went through all Muslim ceremony with a mystical understanding of his own. Well, whether you call it mystical or not, we're all for responsibility for gathering our own understanding. And, we're not supposed to let our ancestors decide things, or our predecessors. We have to straight up, have an understanding for ourselves, because they even offer degrees in understanding your jurisprudence, or whatever you're going to call it, to people who have no jurisprudence. They've memorized the rulings of others. can't even explain why they accept this following a lot of people, even people with degrees that you can see, right? Even some of the more advanced people, like they can't tell you what the Quran says on something except the quote. So the principle involved, they can't, elaborate at all. Now I'm not saying they're all like that. I've just encountered it. He then turns homeward, is entertained for 45 days at Damascus, which he leaves the very day before the Turkish Mahomet's envoys come with 5,000 ducats to carry him to Constantinople. Arriving at Amida, the capital of Mesopotamia, Diyarbakir, he finds war broken out and full flame between that Mahomet and Hassan Beg, king of the country, who has Jami honorably escorted through the dangerous roads to Tabriz. There receives him in Divan, frequent and full of sage and noble, Hassan being a great admirer of learning, and would fain have him abide at court a while. Jami, however, is intent on home, and once more seeing his aged mother, for he is turned of 60, and at last touches Herat in the month of Shaban, 1473, after the average year's absence, average for taking the pilgrimage, and one of the things we know that something isn't an Islamic State is if they're starting political wars. It's not just competing over social position and power. It's a self-defense thing. It's here's the people being oppressed or facing aggression. That's what war is about, not this party politics things. And that's the thing that people confuse about the Shia Sunni thing, is that it's not about whether the people descended from the Prophet or not. The Shia narrations make it very clear that they do not accept people because of who they knew or who they were descended from. And they were warned that there be people who descend from Ali and such, and they weren't be accepted as leaders. I mean, not they weren't to be accepted. Not everybody who descended would be rejected. So, but you know what I mean. This is the Hassan, in name and nature handsome, and so described by some Venetian ambassadors of the time, of whose protection Jami speaks in the preliminary vision of this poem, which he dedicates to Hassan's son, Yaqub Beg, who, after the due murder of an elder brother, succeeded to the throne, till all the dynasties of black and white sheep together were swept away a few years after by Ismail, founder of the Sufi dynasty in Persia, or Sophie. I can't tell sometimes with some of these transliterations are supposed to be sounded like that, or sounds more regular, like a Persian or Arabic name. I know some of the Turkish names had changed to not, were a little bit off from the Arabic or Persian. Arrived at home, Jami finds Hussein Mirza Bikara, last of the Timirida, fast seated there, having probably slain ere Jami went. The prince whom Hassan had set up, but the date of a year or two may well wander in the bloody jungle of Persian history. Hussein, however, receives Jami with open arms. Nasamuddin Ali Shir, his vizier, a poet too, had hailed in verse the poet's advent from Damascus as the moon rising in the west, and they both continued affectionately to honor him as long as he lived. Jami sickened of his mortal illness on the 13th of Muharram in 1492, a Sunday. Now, sometimes these Muharram observances are 12 days. and sometimes they're 13. So they do something on the 13th, or people decided different things rather than what the Prophet has said about what to do on Muharram. His pulse began to fail on the following Friday, the hour of morning prayer, and stopped at the very moment when the muezzin began to call to evening. He had lived 81 years. Sultan Hussein undertook the burial of one whose glory it was to have lived and died in dervish poetry, in dervish poverty. Poverty. Okay. The dignities of the kingdom followed him to the grave, where 20 days afterwards was recited in the presence of the Sultan and his court, the eulogy composed by the vizier, who also laid the first stone of a monument to his friend's memory. The first stone of Persian of Jami in the streets of Masjid, a principal thoroughfare of the city of Krat. Masjid? But do they mean masjid? First, the place of worship. 4 says, Rosenweig, it must be kept in mind that Jami was reverenced not only as a poet and philosopher, but as a saint also, who not only might work a miracle himself, but leave the power lingering about his tomb. It always puzzles me why people think there's more power in a person being dead than that person being alive. It was known that once in his life, an Arab who had falsely accused him of selling a camel he knew to be mortally unsound, and very shortly after died, as Jami had predicted, on the very selfsame spot where the camel fell, and that libelous rogue at Baghdad, he putting his hand into his horse's nosebag to see if Das Thier has finished his corn, and his forefinger bitten off by the same. Von Demselben der Zeigefinger abgebissen, of which Verstumlung he soon died, I suppose, as he ought, of lockjaw. His nose bag? Did they mean they had a feed bag tied to his face, or stuck his finger in the nose of the horse? Yeah, you don't. But either way, the Persians, who were adepts at much eloquent ingenuity, are fond of commemorating events by some analogous word or sentence, whose letters cabalistically correspond to certain numbers. Compose the date required. In Jami's case, they have hit upon the word kas, a cup, whose signification brings his own name to memory, and whose relative letters make up his 81 years. They have Tariqa, also for remembering the year of his death. The S can't be the thing. Is it Tariqat or something? Paths for remembering the year of his death. Rosenweig gives some, but Ausili the prettiest, if it will hold. Dud as Khorasan bar Ahmed. The smoke of sighs went up from Khorasan. No biographer, says Rosenweig cautiously, records of Jami that he had more than one wife, granddaughter of his master sheikh, and 4 sons, which, however, are 5 too many for the doctrine of this poem. Of the sons, 3 died infant, and the fourth born to him in very old age, and for whom he wrote some elementary tracts. And the more famous, the Harastan lived, but for a few years he was remembered by his father in preface to his Chiradnama Iskander, a book of morals which perhaps had also been begun for the boy's instruction. Of Jami's wonderful fruitfulness, Bewunderungswürdiger Fruchtbarkeit, as writer Rosenzweig names 44 offsprings, the letters of the word Jam, completing the forced process, that very number. But Shah Khan Ludi, in his Memoirs of the Poets, says Ausali counts him author of 99 volumes of grammar, poetry, and theology, which continue to be universally admired in all parts of the Eastern world. Iran, Turin, and Hindustan copied some of them into precious manuscript, illuminated with gold and painting by the greatest penmen and artists of the time. One such, the Beharastan, said to have cost thousands of pounds. In back in the day when a pound was like a day's wage, or more. Autographed as one most precious treasure of their libraries by two sovereign descendants of Timur upon the throne of Hindustan, what we call India now, and now reposited away from the drums and tramplings of Oriental conquest in the tranquil seclusion of an English library. Of these 99 or 44 volumes, few are known. Conquest in the tranquil seclusion of an English library. And none except the present and one other poem ever printed in England, where the knowledge of Persian might have been politically useful. The poet's name with us is almost solely associated with Yusuf and Zuleika, which, with the other two I've mentioned, count D of the brother stars of that constellation into which Jami, or his admirers, have clustered his 7 best mystical poems under the name of Heft Arang, those 7 thrones, of which we of the West and North give our characteristic name of Great Bear and Charles's Wain. Is it Arcturus Major, or what's the name of the constellation? I think they mean the big constellation for the fall, right? No, Ursa Major, yeah. He must have enjoined great favor and protection from his princes at home, or he would hardly have ventured to write so freely as in this poem he does of doctrine which exposed the Sufi to vulgar abhorrence and danger. Hafiz and others are apologized for as having been obliged to veil a divinity beyond what the prophet dreamt of under the figure of mortal cup and cup-bearer. Jami speaks in Allegory too by way of making a palpable grasp at the skirt of the ineffable, but he also dares in the very thick of Islam to talk of reason as a sole foundation of prophecy, and to paint for what would seem so pantheistic an identification with the deity as shall blind him to any distinction between good and evil. Well, see, this sounds like something that could only be written by somebody that's not as familiar with Islam itself, and trying to, because it's one of those challenges out there. Can you find anything that's good or true that's not supported by the Quran? Can you find anything that's evil or ignorant that's not condemned by the Quran? Try it. I haven't heard anybody that could do it. Not a single thing. But see, people are interpreting and expounding their interpretations and all that other stuff, and yeah, but it's trying to sound like, oh, this guy, saw even further or something like that. It's it's not really a judgment that we can make. Oh, well, he says it this way, which seems to be more about this one verse. It's like, well, look at the other verses. Thank you very much. And you do identify with the divine qualities, except for pride and pomp. You certainly try to be as just in those in the other categories. I must not forget one pretty passage of Jami's life. He had a nephew, one Maulana Abdullah, who was ambitious of following his uncle's footsteps in poetry. Jami first dissuaded him, then by way of trial, whether he had a talent as well as a taste. Bid him imitate Ferdowsi's satire on Shah Mahmud. The nephew did so well that Jami then encouraged him to proceed. Himself wrote the first couplet of his first and most noted poem, Layla and Majnun. This book of which the pen has now laid the foundation, may the diploma of acceptance one day befall it. And Abdallah went on to write that and 4 other poems, which Persia continues and multiplies in fine manuscript and illumination to the present day, remembering their author under his taqalas of Happy, the voice from heaven, and last of the so reputed Persian poets. And of the footnotes, such final adins signify of the faith. Maulana may be taken as master in learning law, etc. Because there's a lot of confusion in the Bible about that sort of talk about Jesus. It's like, well, see, you take a couple ambiguous things and say, see, they knew and no. The only time that it sounds like Jesus was worshipped is at exorcism. And he was called Good Lord. Not Good Lord as in like way of saying, Yahweh or something, or some replacement for Yahweh, but he was like, yeah, the good master, I don't like that term. I only call God that, And we have this note, this in French. Excuse my French. I never learned how to read it. J'aime siliens d'une prédicature Espahan que perchant un jour dans une plaque publique parla furieusement contre ses fils disant que ils étaient des athées à brûler que il se étonnait que on laissat vivre at que de pure un suffit était une action plus agréable à Dieu que de conserver la vie à des hommes de bien 5 ou 6 suffit que étaient parmi les auditeurs se jetteront sur lui après le sermon et la pétirent terriblement et comme dem effortios de l'impecceur ils me désoyant un homme que prêche le neutre doit il se plaindre d'être battu. And that's what Chardin says.